They were just a young couple in love, two college kids with so much ahead of them. 20-year-old Mary Petry was described as a warm, bubbly, self-confident young woman that could often be found on the dean's list. Those who knew 22-year-old Bill Sproat can't help to smile when they remember the quiet, mild-mannered intellect with a great sense of humor. Love wasn't the only common denominator shared by Mary and Bill. They were both devout Catholics, and they both had majored in French. The young students were fortunate enough to study in France on scholarships. Mary and Bill were known to immerse themselves in the language and culture of the country that they felt so passionately about. The couple had their entire future planned out. They would eventually get married after obtaining their degrees in education, and then spend just a few years teaching in the States before heading off to France to live the rest of their lives together. On February 27, 1970, all of these dreams would shatter into a million pieces. Mary and Bill would lose their lives in one of the most gruesome murders Columbus, Ohio had ever seen. Here now are the details of their final hours together. Mary was attending Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, and Bill was attending the Ohio State University in Columbus. On alternating weekends, the couple would commute back and forth between the two cities to spend time with each other. Neither of them could have guessed that their weekend beginning on the 27th would abruptly and cruelly end before it began. Bill had called Mary and explained that he couldn't make the trip to Cincinnati because he had to type up a paper for a class on the following Monday. At the last minute, Mary decided to catch a ride to Columbus with 3 other girls from the university. Terry Ryan, a friend of Mary's, was one of the passengers that day, and this is her account of how the afternoon before the murders began. The driver and another classmate were traveling up north for the weekend and agreed to drop Mary and Terry off at a Holiday Inn in Grove City, just outside of Columbus. Terry's father said that he would pick her up from the inn between 4:30 and 5 p.m., and Mary said that Bill was coming to get her. As the 2 girls chatted in the lobby of the inn, Terry got the impression that Mary was staying at Bill's apartment when she got to Columbus. We will later learn that that wasn't exactly the plan. When Terry's father finally arrived to pick her up, he expressed concern about leaving Mary there alone. He told Mary that he would drive her to Columbus, or she could wait for Bill at their home. Either option would have been a much safer plan. But Mary refused to go. She insisted that Bill was on his way, and that she would be fine until he got there. This is a piece of the puzzle that never quite fit into the actual last hours of Mary and Bill's lives. It seems that Bill never planned to pick Mary up. As soon as Terry and her father left the inn, Mary placed a call to Bill's apartment. Bill's roommate, Tom McGuigan, answered the phone and told Bill that Mary was on the line. Tom said the couple had a brief conversation, and then Bill informed him that Mary was taking a taxi in from Grove City. Tom told Bill that he would stay out that night so he and Mary could have some time together. Tom left at 6 p.m. before Mary arrived. This was the last time Bill was seen alive. Bill's apartment at 178.5 West 8th Avenue was about 6 miles south of the Ohio State University campus and wasn't in a safe area. The neighborhood had poor lighting, and there were reports of women being molested as they walked to and from the campus. In the 2 years prior to Mary and Bill being killed, there had been at least 4 murders in that area. As sexual assaults, muggings, and burglary were spiking, the Ohio State University distanced itself from the dangers to its students. If a crime didn't take place directly on campus, then they weren't going to help address any safety issues for its students. At 6:30 p.m., Mary was dropped off at Bill's apartment. The taxi driver told authorities that he watched Mary carry her small suitcase inside the apartment house, and didn't remember seeing anyone hanging around the outside. The driver was the last person to see Mary alive. Detective James Carr, one of the many that would be assigned to the case, stated that the taxi driver was completely exonerated as a suspect. The driver had a solid alibi as he continued to pick up fares that evening. The apartment house consisted of 4 units with 4 different entries. Most of the doors were faulty and were hardly ever secured and locked. Light bulbs in the entryway were usually burned out. Not long after Mary's arrival, she began to make some phone calls seeking accommodations for the weekend. Mary's twin sister Martha said that Mary was adamantly against premarital sex and would have never stayed over at Bill's apartment. One of Mary's calls went to family friend, Father Raymond Carter, a local high school principal. Mary had hoped to stay at the school's rectory, but Father Carter wasn't there to take the call. He always felt responsible for what happened, stating that had he been there when Mary called, she might be alive today. Mary made her final call at 7:30 p.m. to a girlfriend. She made arrangements to stay with her and said that she would let her know when she would be arriving. There was one call that Mary never made, and that was to her brother David, a chaplain at St. Joseph's Academy in Columbus. David was surprised and a little confused that Mary hadn't called him to say that she was coming in for the weekend, or ask him to pick her up from the Holiday Inn. David said that Mary had stayed with him before, and it wouldn't have been any big deal. The next mysterious detail takes place at 8 p.m. outside of the apartment house. A paper boy claimed that he went inside the house to collect payments. As he was leaving, he ran into a man standing on the porch. The boy said it was dark and he didn't get a very good look at him, but thought he was young. The paper boy said the man yelled, "Get the hell out of here." The next time anyone remembers seeing anything odd about that night occurred at 10 p.m. One of the residents said that Bill's apartment door was slightly ajar. It was dark inside and a radio was playing, but not very loud. Bill's roommate Tom returned to the apartment on Saturday, February 28th at 12:25 p.m. It had now been 18 and a half hours since Tom last saw Bill alive. The first thing he noticed was that the apartment door was 3/4 of the way open. Once he stepped inside, Tom was horrified by the bloody scene. Bill was bound and gagged and lying in a puddle of blood on the bathroom floor. Mary was on Bill's bed and covered in blood. Shocked into momentary disbelief, Tom was able to pull himself together long enough to notify police. Homicide Lieutenant Robert Ruddock was in charge of the 18-man investigation. He said there was no forced entry, and neighbors neither saw nor heard anything unusual during the evening. This information led some officials to conclude that the killer or killers may have been there before and knew the habits of those that lived there. Police said the blood-spattered apartment looked as if the young couple had been caught up in a psychotic impulse, as if the killer didn't mean to go as far as he did. It was definitely a case of overkill. It was personal, passionate, and had the earmarks of a grudge killing. The sweet couple were quiet, religious intellects that didn't drink, gamble, or use drugs. So what could either of them have done to push someone over the edge? Which one of them could have been the target? Nothing of value seemed to be missing from the apartment beyond a small amount of cash taken from Mary and Bill's wallets and a 2x3 gold fringe rug. The missing rug was found in the back of a bakery delivery truck a week after the murders. The rug was thrown into the truck when it was parked in an alley 8 blocks south of Bill's apartment. Traces of Mary's blood was found on it. The other odd detail that police noticed right away was a chair in the apartment that had been pushed up against a window to hold the curtain shut. Immediately, police began to focus on a possible link to one or more serial rapists that were active in the neighborhood. All of these sexual assaults were within 2 miles of Bill's apartment, putting him right in the center of the crimes. The perpetrator in those cases was able to gain entry to the victim's home by pretending to need to use a phone. In each case, the perp was careful to make sure that the victim's windows were covered. Using descriptions from 6 of the women attacked, police were able to create a composite sketch. The man was between 23 to 26 years of age, 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, 175 to 185 pounds, with brown eyes and hair. One notable feature was pockmarks on his cheeks. Now let's move on to the wounds and positioning of Mary and Bill's bodies as noted by police at the beginning of the investigation. Neither of the victims put up a great amount of resistance. Bill's sister Patricia said her brother was not a fighter kind of person. Mary was located in Bill's bedroom. She was nude below the waist and propped up on the bed with a gag in her mouth. She had been savagely beaten about the head and body. Mary had sustained at least 7 or more stab wounds, and there were signs of a possible sexual assault. There were traces of what looked like semen found on the bedspread. Bloody fingerprints on the back of the headboard had been overlooked by local police and found by BCI 5 days later on March 4th. As of today, those fingerprints remain unidentified. Bill was found face down on the bathroom floor. His wrists were bound to his ankles behind his back with wire coat hangers. The hangers were wound so tightly that police believe pliers may have been used to tighten them. There was a gag in Bill's mouth, and he had been beaten and stabbed several times. The weapons used on both victims were believed to be a butcher knife from the kitchen with a 7.5-inch blade and a bowling ball found near Mary's body. This is what Deputy Coroner William Adrian had to say about the murders. Adrian indicated that the time of death was between 7:30 and 10 p.m. It was possible that the killer or killers were already in the apartment when Mary arrived, or the couple let someone in that they were familiar with. The hangers binding Bill contained strands of Mary's hair, indicating that the same wire had been used to restrain her, and she was the first victim. Adrian went on to state that the killer acted out the murders in an almost methodical way. Each victim bore 12 to 20 stab wounds, but in a limited area of their upper bodies, forming a sort of pattern. Adrian was reluctant to share any further information at the time. Using more recent advancements in science, an in-depth look at the original findings on Mary and Bill's autopsy has given us a different perspective on the wounds and what may have inflicted them. We'll start with Mary's examination first. Mary sustained blunt force trauma to places on the back of her head. Her skull was fractured in multiple places while she was still alive. These injuries are more consistent with an object with an edge than with a bowling ball, as first believed. Mary had a man's shirt tied around her neck with a sock at the front. The sock was most likely used as a gag, and it had slipped down from her mouth as she was being strangled. Scratch marks were found under the t-shirt as Mary was trying desperately to loosen the ligature. She had a total of 23 stab wounds, 8 under her left shoulder blade and 15 under her right shoulder blade. All of the stab wounds were clustered together at the same angle after Mary was dead. If she had been alive, there would have been a struggle, and the stab wounds would have had different angles. The knife used was more consistent with a double-edged knife, unlike the kitchen knife that has been photographed. If the current analysis of the objects used in the killings is correct, then the murder weapons have never been found. Moving on to Bill's injuries, we find that his injuries are very similar to Mary's. Bill had blunt force trauma injuries to the back of his head, causing his skull to fracture. He was also alive while the blows were being inflicted. A shirt was knotted around his neck and through his mouth as a gag. Bill's neck had the same scratch marks where he was clawing to remove it. Bill also had a total of 16 stab wounds to his back, 8 on his right shoulder blade and 8 on his left. He was alive when the stabbings occurred. There wasn't enough documentation to determine if the stab wounds were made with a double-edged knife, as in Mary's case. Bill died face down, and this is known by the pooling of the blood beneath him. Police have always considered these murders to be a grudge killing, reflective of the personal brutality inflicted by the killer. But experts' interpretation of the wounds today seem more consistent with paraphilia, where the suffering or humiliation inflicted upon the victim arouses the perpetrator. There were no rape kits in 1970, and reports have surfaced that the coroner made no attempt to verify or document if Mary and Bill had been sexually assaulted. While the crime is consistent with sexual motivation, it did not fit the MO of any of the serial rapists active at the time. Now that we have gone over Mary and Bill's wounds, let's move on to the final phase of the case, which is the focus of persons of interest. Although police have revealed very little about their investigation, here is a brief glimpse into the possible leads that have stymied their progress for over 54 years. Sharon Katz. On September 29, 1970, just 7 months after Bill and Mary were murdered, the body of Sharon Katz was found by her husband in the bathtub of their apartment. The 21-year-old OSU student had been sexually assaulted and drowned in 6 to 8 inches of scalding water. Twine was wrapped around her throat in an attempt to strangle her. Bruises on her left temple indicated that she may have been rendered unconscious during the struggle with her attacker. Sharon was blistered with second-degree burns over 40% of her body. James Kiefer, a plumber for the Katz, was identified through DNA testing in 2006 as the person responsible for Sharon's murder. Kiefer was a convicted felon who served time in prison for assault with the intent to kill and burglary. Kiefer died in 2002 and was cremated. His parents agreed to supply their DNA for testing. It was their samples that linked Kiefer to Sharon's murder. So far, Kiefer has not been linked to the murders of Mary and Bill. Christina Mitchell. On February 16, 1971, the bodies of 25-year-old Christina Mitchell and her 8-month-old son Scott were found by her husband in their apartment. Christina was nude on their bed. She was gagged and her hands and feet were tied in front of her. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed over 12 times. The knife was left protruding from her chest. 8-month-old Scott was found head first in the bathroom toilet. His skull was crushed, and it looked as if he had been swung by the feet and smashed against the wall. The child had also been stabbed between the eyes. The Mitchell's apartment was just 5 blocks from Bill's apartment, and Christina was known to attend cultural events on the OSU campus on several occasions. In 1974, while serving time in prison for a separate crime, John Miller Jr. admitted to a prison guard to murdering Christina and her son. He bragged about using the Mitchell's camera to take photos of the carnage he left behind, and proudly boasted about leaving the knife embedded in Christina's chest, a detail only police knew. While there are many similarities between the Mitchell murders and Mary and Bill's, no connection has been made so far. Barbara Davlin White. Barbara was an art major that lived in the same dorm, just 9 doors away from Mary Petry, and was a classmate and friend at Mount St. Joseph's. The 2 young women weren't close friends, but Barbara did design Mary's wedding ring for when the couple decided to announce their engagement. Barbara was found murdered on March 2, 1972, in a Columbus, Ohio parking garage. She was shot twice in the back of the head and once in the left arm. White was found lying diagonally across the front passenger seat that had been folded down, and the passenger side door was locked. Police believe that the killer was sitting in the back seat when he fired the shots. Barbara had not been sexually assaulted, and her purse containing $40 had not been touched. There were several hundred people coming and going from the fifth-floor parking area, and yet no one remembered seeing or hearing anything. Barbara's murder remains unsolved, and it's still a mystery if it's in any way connected to Mary. The Frenchman. Mary had made friends with two men when she was in France. The two Frenchmen had planned to meet up with Mary on a trip to America in February. The Monday after Mary's weekend with Bill, she was to see the men who were staying in Columbus for a brief time. No one that had made that last trip to France with Mary recalled ever seeing her with two Frenchmen. Police questioned the men and quickly released them from any involvement in the murders. But then from time to time, their friendship with Mary would come back into question. Police have stated that there are 3 persons of interest in this case. It's unknown if the Frenchmen were included on that short list. And this is where Mary and Bill's case begins to go cold. Their families have been very vocal about their frustrations with law enforcement. Over the decades, they have fought for answers and even prodded investigators to pursue forensic genealogy testing. As with many cases like Mary and Bill's, authorities must be careful to not use up the quantity of DNA that remains in these older cases. It's a known fact that a higher quality profile is needed in familial searches. Once that DNA sample is used up, there's no going back. Those who continue to investigate Mary and Bill's murders believe that the reason that they've never gotten a hit off CODIS is because this was a personal crime, a grudge killing. This person more than likely never committed a crime before or since. The Petry and Sproat families understand what's at stake as far as the DNA testing goes. They believe one last final push to get results far outweighs the risks. But for now, they must wait for investigators to exhaust all other leads. The prosecution will also weigh in on the decision before the courts will allow such testing to move forward. Mary Petry and Bill Sproat were going to build a life together. One person, or perhaps two, decided that they weren't going to let this couple have their happily ever after. Was this person a serial rapist? Someone with a grudge? A twisted soul looking to inflict unimaginable pain for the thrill of it? I don't have the answers. Do you? If you have any information about these murders, please contact the Columbus Police Department at 614-645-4760. Are you obsessed with true crime content? Subscribe now and join our growing community as we analyze and discuss the details of some truly baffling cold cases. Browse our growing library of cold case investigations and immerse yourself in the mysteries that keep us up at night. Subscribe and join the EOJ community today. All it takes is a click.